Beatrice Martin stepped off the bus and took a deep breath of the cool, crisp air of Riverstone. The town looked almost the same as it did when she left 5 years ago, quaint, with its cobblestone streets and old-fashioned lamp posts. But for Beatrice, everything felt different now. She wasn't the same naive girl who had left to find a better life in the city. She was back with a purpose, a resolve hardened by years of knowing the truth about her father's downfall. As she walked through the familiar streets, memories flooded back. She remembered running through these streets as a child, her father's laughter echoing behind her. But those carefree days had ended abruptly when the Harrison family's betrayal shattered their lives. Her father, once a respected businessman, had been reduced to a broken man, struggling to make ends meet. The anger that simmered inside her since then had brought her back, and she intended to make the Harrisons pay. Her first stop was the hospital. Beatrice's heart ached as she approached her father's room, the beeping of medical equipment growing louder with each step. The sight of him, frail and bedridden, almost made her lose her composure. She forced a smile and sat by his side. "Dad," she whispered, holding his hand gently. "I came back." Her father opened his eyes slowly, a weak smile forming on his lips. "Beatrice, my daughter. I knew you would come back." They talked about mundane things, avoiding the topic that hung heavily between them. Finally, her father's expression grew serious. "In my wardrobe," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "The documents are there. They prove everything." Beatrice nodded, her resolve strengthening. She knew what she had to do. The documents were the key to her plan. They detailed the illegal activities and betrayals that the Harrison family had committed, including the evidence that had ruined her father. Leaving the hospital, Beatrice headed to the old family home. The house was in disrepair, a stark reminder of what they had lost. She found the documents exactly where her father said they would be, hidden in a secret compartment in his wardrobe. As she read through them, her anger reignited. The Harrisons had not only framed her father but had profited immensely from his downfall. She clutched the papers tightly, vowing to use them to bring justice. With the documents safely tucked away, Beatrice made her way to the local cafe where she had arranged to start working. It was the perfect place to gather information, frequented by many, including the Harrisons. As she walked in, the smell of fresh coffee and baked goods welcomed her, a stark contrast to the turmoil in her heart. The cafe owner, Mrs. Thompson, greeted her warmly. "You must be Beatrice. Welcome to Riverstone Cafe. We're glad to have you here." Beatrice smiled, masking her inner turmoil. "Thank you, Mrs. Thompson. I'm excited to be here." She quickly settled into her new job, using it as a cover to observe the Harrisons. It didn't take long for her to spot John Harrison, the heir to the Harrison fortune, who often came in for his morning coffee. He was tall, with a charming smile and a kind demeanor that didn't match the image she had of the Harrisons. But Beatrice reminded herself that appearances could be deceiving. As she served him his coffee, their eyes met briefly, and she felt an unexpected jolt. There was something disarming about his smile, something that made her momentarily forget her mission. But she quickly recovered, reminding herself why she was here. She couldn't afford to be distracted, not when she was so close to avenging her father. Beatrice finished her shift, her mind racing with plans and strategies. She knew she had to be careful, to bide her time and gather more information before making her move. But for now, she had made the first step. She was back in Riverstone, and the wheels of her plan were in motion. The next morning, Beatrice awoke with a renewed sense of purpose. She dressed quickly, her mind already on the day's tasks. Her job at the cafe was the perfect vantage point, allowing her to observe the Harrisons without arousing suspicion. She needed to be cautious, calculating each move like a chess game where every piece mattered. When she arrived at the cafe, the morning rush was already in full swing. Beatrice slipped into her role seamlessly, serving customers with a smile while her eyes discreetly scanned the room. It wasn't long before she spotted John Harrison entering the cafe. He greeted Mrs. Thompson with his usual charm, ordered his coffee, and found a seat near the window. Beatrice brought him his coffee, her heart pounding as she approached. She needed to stay focused, to remember her mission. As she set the cup on the table, John looked up and smiled. "Thank you," he said, his voice warm and polite. "You're welcome," Beatrice replied, managing a polite smile. "If you need anything else, just let me know." She turned to leave, but John's voice stopped her. "Actually, I could use some company. If you're not too busy, would you like to join me for a moment?" Caught off guard, Beatrice hesitated. This was an opportunity she hadn't anticipated so soon. She couldn't afford to let it slip by. "Sure, I have a few minutes." She sat across from him, her mind racing. They made small talk, discussing the weather and the charm of Riverstone. John seemed genuinely interested in her, asking about her background and what brought her to town. Beatrice kept her answers vague, not wanting to reveal too much. She needed to maintain her cover. "I've been away for a while," she said, stirring her coffee. "But it's good to be back. Riverstone has always felt like home." John nodded, his expression thoughtful. "It's a special place. My family has been here for generations. We've seen it change so much over the years." Beatrice's curiosity got the better of her. "Your family must have a lot of influence here. It must be challenging to manage all of that." John smiled ruefully. "It can be. My mother runs most of the business now. She's very dedicated to maintaining our legacy." The mention of Eleanor Harrison sent a shiver down Beatrice's spine. She could see the complexity in John's eyes, a hint of burden that made him more human. It was a side of him she hadn't expected to see, and it unsettled her. Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of more customers, and Beatrice excused herself to return to work. As she moved through the cafe, her thoughts were in turmoil. John was proving to be more complicated than she had anticipated. He wasn't the enemy she had imagined, and that realization was dangerous. Beatrice finished her shift and left the cafe, her mind replaying the conversation with John. She needed to stay focused. Her father's voice echoed in her mind, reminding her of the purpose that had brought her back to Riverstone. She couldn't afford to be distracted by John's charm or the unexpected connection she felt with him. That evening, Beatrice reviewed the documents again, reinforcing her resolve. She mapped out her next steps, planning how she would gather more information about the Harrisons. She knew she had to be patient, to wait for the right moment to strike. For now, she had managed to get closer to John without raising suspicion. It was a small victory, but an important one. She needed to build on that, to use every interaction to her advantage. The game had only just begun, and Beatrice was determined to play it to the end. The days at the cafe passed in a blur of routine tasks and careful observation. Beatrice settled into her new life, making connections and subtly gathering information. The Harrison family had a strong presence in Riverstone, and their influence was apparent in the way people spoke about them. Beatrice listened closely, piecing together the public perception and the private whispers. One afternoon, while wiping down the tables after the lunch rush, Beatrice struck up a conversation with Emily, one of the longtime employees of the Harrison estate. Emily was a chatty woman, always eager to share the latest gossip. Beatrice saw an opportunity and decided to cultivate a friendship with her. "You've worked for the Harrisons for a long time, haven't you?" Beatrice asked casually. Emily nodded, a hint of pride in her expression. "Oh yes, for almost 20 years now. Seen a lot come and go in that house." "Must be interesting work," Beatrice continued, her tone light. "I imagine you get to know a lot about the family." Emily leaned in, lowering her voice. "You have no idea. The things I could tell you. Well, let's just say it's not all perfect behind those mansion walls." Beatrice's curiosity piqued. "Really? Like what?" Emily looked around, ensuring no one was listening. "For one, Eleanor Harrison is a piece of work. Always controlling everything, making sure things go her way. And John, bless him, he's nothing like her. Kind-hearted, but caught in the middle of all the family drama. Beatrice filed this information away, knowing it could be useful. Sounds tough. I've seen John around. He seems like a good guy. He is, Emily agreed. Too good for his own good sometimes. But he's got his secrets too, like everyone else. Beatrice smiled, masking her excitement. Secrets? Now you have me intrigued. Emily chuckled. Oh, I shouldn't gossip. But let's just say, not everything in that family is as it seems. There's been talk of old deals, things done to keep the family on top. Their conversation was cut short as more customers entered, but Beatrice knew she had made progress. Emily would be a valuable source of inside information, and Beatrice intended to cultivate that relationship further. That evening, Beatrice attended a party at the Harrison estate. She had managed to secure an invitation through her growing network of contacts. The mansion was even grander than she remembered, a symbol of the wealth and power that had come at such a high cost to her family. As she mingled with the guests, she kept a close eye on John and Eleanor. John moved through the crowd with ease, charming everyone with his smile and polite conversation. Eleanor, on the other hand, exuded an air of control, her sharp eyes missing nothing. Beatrice found herself near a group of guests discussing the Harrison family. She listened intently, picking up bits of conversation about old business deals and the family's extensive influence in the town. It was clear that the Harrisons had their fingers in many pies, and their reach extended far beyond what she had initially thought. As the night wore on, Beatrice noticed John stepping out onto the balcony alone. She saw an opportunity and followed him, her heart pounding. She needed to get closer, to understand him better if she was going to succeed in her plan. Beautiful night, isn't it? She said, joining him. John turned, surprised but pleased to see her. It is. Sometimes it's nice to get away from the crowd. Beatrice nodded, standing beside him. They looked out over the garden, the silence between them comfortable. She felt a momentary pang of guilt for using him, but quickly pushed it aside. This was necessary. As they stood there, the moon casting a soft glow over the scene, Beatrice couldn't help but feel the weight of her mission pressing down on her. She was getting closer to her goal, but the lines were becoming increasingly blurred. She had to remind herself of why she was here, of the promise she made to her father. The days following the party brought an unexpected shift in Beatrice's life. Her encounters with John became more frequent and less contrived, as if the universe was conspiring to bring them together. She found herself drawn to him, not just as a means to an end, but as a person. This new development troubled her, but she couldn't deny the growing connection between them. One sunny afternoon, Beatrice was walking through the town square when she spotted John sitting on a bench, reading a book. She hesitated, then decided to approach him. After all, maintaining their connection was crucial for her plan. "Fancy meeting you here," she said with a smile as she walked up to him. John looked up, his face lighting up with a genuine smile. "Beatrice! What a pleasant surprise. Care to join me?" She sat down beside him, glancing at the book in his hands. "What are you reading?" "Just some light reading," he replied, showing her the cover. "It's a novel about redemption and second chances." "Sounds interesting," Beatrice said, her mind wandering to her own quest for justice and redemption. They talked about books and their favorite authors, finding common ground in their love for literature. Beatrice was surprised at how easy it was to talk to John, how natural their conversation felt. He was intelligent, kind, and deeply passionate about his interests. It was a side of him she hadn't expected to see, and it made her task all the more complicated. As the afternoon sun began to set, casting a golden hue over the town, John suggested a walk by the river. Beatrice agreed, and they strolled along the water's edge, the sound of the flowing river providing a soothing backdrop to their conversation. "Do you ever feel like there's more to life than what we're given?" John asked suddenly, his tone thoughtful. Beatrice glanced at him, surprised by the question. "What do you mean?" John sighed, looking out over the river. "Sometimes, I feel trapped by my family's expectations and the legacy I'm supposed to uphold. I want to do something meaningful, something that makes a real difference. His words resonated with Beatrice. She understood the feeling of being trapped by circumstances beyond one's control. For the first time, she saw John not as an obstacle but as a kindred spirit. This realization frightened her because it threatened to derail her mission. I understand, she said softly. Sometimes, we have to carve out our own path, no matter how difficult it may seem. John looked at her, his eyes filled with an intensity that made her heart race. I think that's why I'm drawn to you, Beatrice. You seem to understand me in a way no one else does. Beatrice felt a lump in her throat. She wanted to tell him everything, to confess her true intentions, but the risk was too great. She couldn't afford to lose focus now, not when she was so close to uncovering the truth. Thank you, John, she said instead. I appreciate that. They continued their walk in companionable silence, each lost in their own thoughts. Beatrice felt a pang of guilt for deceiving John, but she reminded herself that it was necessary. She had a promise to keep, and nothing could stand in the way of that. Over the next few weeks, Beatrice and John grew closer. They spent more time together, their conversations deepening with each passing day. Beatrice found herself laughing more, feeling a sense of normalcy she hadn't felt in years. But underneath it all, the mission loomed large, a constant reminder of why she was here. One evening, as they sat on the porch of the cafe after closing time, John turned to her with a serious expression. Beatrice, I feel like I can trust you. There's something I need to tell you about my family, about my mother. Beatrice's heart skipped a beat. This was it, the moment she had been waiting for. She braced herself, ready to listen, hoping that this conversation would bring her one step closer to the truth. John took a deep breath. My mother, she's done things, terrible things to maintain our family's power. I've started to uncover some of it, and it's worse than I imagined. Beatrice listened intently, every word confirming her suspicions. But as she looked at John, she saw the pain in his eyes, and it made her question everything. Could she really go through with her plan, knowing it would hurt someone she had come to care for deeply? As the night grew darker, Beatrice felt the weight of her dilemma pressing down on her. She was torn between the promise she had made to her father and the unexpected love she had found in John. The path ahead was unclear, and for the first time, she felt truly lost. The days following John's revelation were a whirlwind of emotions for Beatrice. She found herself grappling with the growing affection she felt for him and the heavy burden of her mission. Each day at the cafe, she went through the motions, her mind constantly occupied with thoughts of John and the secrets he had shared. One afternoon, as she was preparing coffee, John walked in, his expression tense. He approached the counter, and Beatrice could see the worry etched on his face. Can we talk? He asked quietly. Beatrice nodded, motioning for Mrs. Thompson to cover for her. She followed John to a quiet corner of the cafe where they could speak privately. He looked around nervously before speaking. I've been doing some digging, John said, his voice barely above a whisper. There are documents, hidden files in my mother's office that might explain everything. Beatrice's heart raced. This could be the breakthrough she needed. Have you seen them? John shook his head. Not yet. I haven't had the chance to get to them. My mother's always around, and she's very protective of her office. But I know where they are. Beatrice placed a reassuring hand on his. We'll find a way. Together. John looked at her, a mix of gratitude and determination in his eyes. Thank you, Beatrice. I don't know what I'd do without you. That evening, Beatrice went home, her mind whirling with plans. She needed to get those documents. They could be the key to exposing Eleanor and bringing justice for her father. But how could she get into the Harrison mansion without raising suspicion? The next day, she met Emily for lunch, using the opportunity to gather more information. Over sandwiches and iced tea, Emily divulged more about the Harrison household, including the security measures in place. Getting into Eleanor's office won't be easy, Emily said, her brow furrowed. She's very particular about who goes in there. Only her and John have the keys. John mentioned some hidden files in her office, Beatrice said, careful to sound casual. Do you know anything about that? Emily shook her head. Not specifically, but it wouldn't surprise me. She's always been secretive. If there are hidden files, they're likely in her private safe. Only she knows the combination. Beatrice's mind raced with possibilities. She needed to find a way to get that combination. It was a risky move, but she was willing to take the chance. Later that night, Beatrice and John met at a secluded spot by the river. The moonlight reflected off the water, creating a serene atmosphere that contrasted sharply with the turmoil inside her. John, I need to get into your mother's office, Beatrice said, her voice firm. Those documents could be the key to everything. John looked conflicted. I know. But how? She never lets anyone near that safe. We'll have to find a way, Beatrice insisted. Maybe there's a way to distract her or get her out of the house. John thought for a moment. She's hosting a charity gala in a few days. She'll be busy with preparations and might leave the house for a few hours to finalize the arrangements. Beatrice nodded. That's our chance. We'll need to be quick and careful. If she finds out, it could ruin everything. Over the next few days, Beatrice and John meticulously planned their approach. They coordinated with Emily, who would help distract the household staff during the gala. Beatrice felt a mix of excitement and dread. This was a critical moment, and failure wasn't an option. The night of the gala arrived, and Beatrice's nerves were on edge. She and John waited until the house was quiet before making their move. John led her through the mansion, their footsteps silent on the plush carpets. They reached Eleanor's office, and John quickly unlocked the door. Inside, the room was dimly lit, the shadows creating an eerie atmosphere. John pointed to the safe hidden behind a painting. Beatrice's hands trembled as she worked on the combination, guided by the numbers John had managed to overhear. The safe clicked open, revealing stacks of papers and files. Beatrice rifled through them, her eyes scanning for anything that could link Eleanor to her father's downfall. She found several documents detailing shady business deals and illegal activities, but one file in particular caught her attention. It was a detailed account of the scheme that had ruined her father, complete with signatures and dates. Beatrice felt a surge of triumph and relief. She had the evidence she needed. But as she turned to show John, the sound of footsteps echoed in the hallway. Panic set in as they realized Eleanor had returned earlier than expected. Hide, John whispered urgently. I'll distract her. Beatrice quickly hid behind a curtain as John stepped out to intercept his mother. Her heart pounded in her chest as she listened to their muffled conversation, praying they wouldn't be discovered. Beatrice held her breath, her heart racing as she listened to the muffled voices outside Eleanor's office. The curtain offered little protection, and she knew that if Eleanor entered the room, she would be caught. She strained to hear the conversation between John and his mother, hoping he could keep her from coming inside. John, what are you doing here? Eleanor's voice was sharp, filled with suspicion. I was looking for some documents I needed for the charity gala, John replied smoothly. I thought I left them in your office. Eleanor's tone softened slightly, but the suspicion lingered. You should have asked me. You know how I feel about anyone being in my office without permission. I'm sorry, Mother. It won't happen again, John said, trying to sound contrite. I'll just grab what I need and go. Beatrice heard Eleanor sigh, and the tension in the air seemed to lessen. Very well. Just be quick about it. We don't have much time before the guests start arriving. John murmured an acknowledgement, and Beatrice listened as their footsteps receded down the hallway. She waited a few more moments before daring to move. When she finally stepped out from behind the curtain, her hands were still shaking. John returned shortly after, his face pale but determined. We don't have much time. We need to get out of here before she comes back. Beatrice nodded, clutching the incriminating documents tightly. They slipped out of the office and made their way through the mansion, avoiding the staff and guests who were beginning to arrive. The tension was palpable, and Beatrice's mind raced with the implications of what they had found. Once they were safely outside, Beatrice let out a breath she didn't realize she had been holding. John looked at her, his expression a mix of relief and concern. "Did you get what you needed?" he asked. Beatrice nodded, showing him the documents. "These should be enough to expose her. But we need to be careful. If she suspects anything, she'll do everything in her power to stop us." John's jaw tightened. "She won't get away with this. Not anymore." As they walked back to Beatrice's place, they discussed their next steps. They needed to find a way to make the information public without putting themselves in immediate danger. It was a delicate balance, and one wrong move could jeopardize everything. The following day, Beatrice met with Emily again, thanking her for her help during the gala. Emily was curious, but didn't press for details, sensing the gravity of the situation. Beatrice appreciated her discretion and assured her that justice would soon be served. At the cafe, Beatrice and John continued to meet secretly, planning their strategy. They decided to involve a trusted journalist who could help them expose Eleanor's crimes without alerting her prematurely. Beatrice knew this was a risky move, but it was the only way to ensure the truth reached the public. As the days went by, Beatrice noticed a change in Eleanor's behavior. She seemed more guarded, her eyes constantly scanning her surroundings as if she sensed something was amiss. Beatrice knew they had to act quickly before Eleanor took drastic measures. One evening, as Beatrice was closing up the cafe, Eleanor walked in. Beatrice's heart skipped a beat, but she maintained her composure. Eleanor approached the counter, her expression unreadable. "I've heard some interesting things about you, Beatrice," Eleanor said, her tone casual but with an underlying threat. "You seem to have become quite close to my son." Beatrice forced a smile. "John is a good friend. He's been very kind to me." Eleanor's eyes narrowed slightly. "Kindness can be a weakness, you know. Especially in a town like this." Beatrice met her gaze, refusing to be intimidated. "I suppose that depends on your perspective." Eleanor leaned in, her voice low. "Just remember, Beatrice, not everything is as it seems. People have a way of hiding their true intentions. Be careful who you trust." With that, Eleanor turned and walked out, leaving Beatrice with a sense of foreboding. The game was escalating, and the stakes were higher than ever. Beatrice knew she had to be more cautious, but she also felt a renewed determination. She couldn't let Eleanor win. Beatrice's encounter with Eleanor left her feeling unsettled. She knew that Eleanor's suspicion could mean trouble, and she needed to be more vigilant than ever. Despite the looming danger, her bond with John continued to grow stronger, complicating her feelings and her mission. One evening, John invited Beatrice to dinner at a small, cozy restaurant on the outskirts of town. It was a quiet place, away from prying eyes, where they could talk freely. As they sat across from each other, the candlelight casting a warm glow on their faces, Beatrice felt a pang of guilt. She was falling for him, and it was becoming harder to keep up the pretense. "Beatrice, there's something I need to tell you," John began, his voice serious. "I've been thinking a lot about us and what we've been through together. I care about you deeply." Beatrice's heart ached. She wanted to tell him everything, to come clean about her true intentions, but the fear of losing him held her back. "John, I care about you too," she said softly, her eyes meeting his. John reached across the table, taking her hand in his. "I feel like I can trust you with anything. And I want you to know that I'm here for you, no matter what." Tears welled up in Beatrice's eyes. She squeezed his hand, wishing she could freeze this moment in time. But the reality of their situation loomed over them like a dark cloud. After dinner, they walked along the river, the night air cool and refreshing. John stopped suddenly, turning to face her. "Beatrice, I love you," he said, his voice filled with emotion. Beatrice felt a surge of conflicting emotions. She loved him too, but she couldn't ignore the mission that had brought her to Riverstone. She knew she had to tell him the truth, but the words stuck in her throat. "I love you too, John," she whispered, the weight of her secret pressing down on her. They stood there, wrapped in each other's arms, the world around them fading away. For a moment, everything felt perfect. But Beatrice knew that this moment of bliss was fragile, and the truth could shatter it at any time. The next day, Beatrice decided it was time to confront her father. She visited him in the hospital, hoping he could provide some clarity. As she sat by his bedside, she felt a mix of love and anger. "Dad, I need to talk to you about something important," Beatrice began, her voice trembling. "I'm in love with John, but he's a Harrison. I should hate him, but I can't." Her father's eyes softened as he listened. "My daughter, love is complicated. I know that revenge seemed like the only way to find justice, but maybe there's another way." Beatrice was taken aback. "But Dad, everything they did to you." "I know," he interrupted gently. "But maybe the truth is more powerful than revenge. If you love John, maybe he can help us expose the truth without destroying everything in the process." Beatrice felt a glimmer of hope. Perhaps her father was right. Maybe there was a way to achieve justice without sacrificing her love for John. That evening, she met John again, determined to tell him the truth. They sat on the porch of the cafe, the setting sun painting the sky in hues of orange and pink. "John, there's something I need to tell you," Beatrice began, her voice shaking. "I haven't been completely honest with you." John looked at her, concern etched on his face. "What is it, Beatrice?" She took a deep breath, gathering her courage. "I came back to Riverstone to seek revenge on your family. Your mother ruined my father's life, and I wanted to expose her." John's expression shifted from confusion to hurt. You came here to use me?" Tears streamed down Beatrice's face. "At first, yes. But then I got to know you, and I fell in love with you. I didn't expect this to happen." John stood up, stepping away from her. "I don't know what to say. I trusted you, Beatrice. I thought we had something real." "We do," she pleaded, standing up as well. "I love you, John. I never meant to hurt you. Please, believe me." John looked torn, his emotions warring on his face. "I need some time to think," he said finally, turning away. As Beatrice watched him walk away, her heart broke. She knew she had done the right thing by telling him the truth, but the pain of potentially losing him was almost unbearable. She stood there, alone and afraid, wondering if she had lost the love of her life in her quest for justice. The days that followed were some of the hardest Beatrice had ever experienced. She went about her daily routine at the cafe, but everything felt hollow without John. Her confession had created a rift between them, and she was uncertain if it could ever be mended. Yet, she couldn't dwell on her heartbreak for too long. There was still work to be done. One evening, unable to bear the silence of her empty apartment, Beatrice decided to delve deeper into her father's past. She needed to understand the full extent of what had happened. She retrieved the hidden documents from her father's old wardrobe, spreading them out on her small kitchen table. As she sifted through the papers, a new realization dawned upon her. Among the documents were old letters and business records that painted a different picture of her father. She found correspondence that suggested he might have been involved in some questionable dealings himself. The evidence pointed to a partnership with the Harrisons that had gone sour, leading to their betrayal. Her hands trembled as she read through the letters. The story she had believed for so long was more complicated than she had ever imagined. Her father wasn't entirely innocent, and this revelation shook her to the core. The man she had idolized had made mistakes, and those mistakes had contributed to their downfall. Beatrice felt a mix of anger and sadness. She had been so focused on seeking vengeance that she had overlooked the complexities of the situation. Her father's actions, though driven by desperation, had played a role in the events that had unfolded. She needed to confront him with this new information to understand his side of the story. The next day, Beatrice visited the hospital again. Her father looked frilier than before, but his eyes lit up when he saw her. "Dad, I found some old letters and documents," Beatrice began, trying to keep her voice steady. "There are things you never told me." Her father sighed, a deep sadness filling his eyes. I did what I thought was necessary to support us. But in the end, I lost everything. And you paid the price for it too. Why did you never tell me? Beatrice asked, tears welling up in her eyes. I would have understood. We could have faced it together. I didn't want you to see the worst of me, he replied, his voice breaking. I wanted you to remember me as an honest man. Beatrice took his hand, her heart aching. I still love you, Dad. Nothing will change that. But now I need to know the truth so I can move forward. They talked for hours, her father recounting his side of the story. He admitted his mistakes and expressed his regret for the choices he had made. Beatrice felt a sense of closure, but also a renewed determination to seek justice, not just for her father, but for the truth. That night, as Beatrice sat alone in her apartment, she thought about John. She knew she needed to speak with him, to explain what she had discovered. Their relationship might be broken, but he deserved to know the full truth. She sent him a message, asking to meet. To her relief, he agreed. They met at their usual spot by the river, the moonlight casting a gentle glow over the water. John's expression was guarded, but he listened as Beatrice recounted what she had learned. My father made mistakes, Beatrice admitted. He wasn't innocent, but the Harrisons still did terrible things to ruin him. I understand now that the truth is more complicated, and I'm sorry for not seeing that sooner. John's eyes softened. Thank you for telling me, Beatrice. It means a lot. I've been doing my own digging too, and I found some things about my family that I didn't know. We both have pieces of the puzzle. They sat in silence for a moment, the weight of their discoveries settling in. Beatrice reached out and took John's hand. I still love you, John. And I want to find a way to make things right, together. John squeezed her hand, a small smile forming on his lips. I love you too, Beatrice. We'll figure this out, one step at a time. As they sat there, hand in hand, Beatrice felt a glimmer of hope. The path ahead was still uncertain, but at least they were facing it together. The following days were a whirlwind of activity as Beatrice and John worked together to piece together the full story. Their relationship, though still strained, began to mend as they shared their findings and planned their next steps. Trust was slowly being rebuilt, and the bond between them grew stronger with each passing day. One afternoon, John arrived at the cafe with a look of determination on his face. He beckoned Beatrice to join him outside, away from prying eyes. I found something important, he said, his voice low. We need to talk. Beatrice followed him to a secluded bench in the park. The air was crisp, and the leaves rustled gently in the breeze. John pulled out a folder from his bag and handed it to her. I managed to get access to some of my mother's private files, he explained. It wasn't easy, but I found documents that confirm everything we suspected, and more. Beatrice's hands trembled as she opened the folder. Inside were contracts, financial records, and correspondence that detailed a web of corruption and deceit. Eleanor Harrison had not only orchestrated the downfall of Beatrice's father, but had also been involved in numerous illegal activities to maintain her family's wealth and power. This is it, Beatrice whispered, her eyes scanning the pages. This is the proof we need. John nodded, his expression grim. There's more. I found evidence that implicates several other prominent figures in town. My mother wasn't working alone. Beatrice looked up at him, a mixture of determination and fear in her eyes. What do we do now? John took her hand, his grip reassuring. We need to expose this. All of it. But we have to be careful. If my mother finds out what we're planning, she'll try to stop us. They decided to contact a trusted journalist, someone who could help them bring the story to light without compromising their safety. Beatrice knew just the person, an old friend of her father's who had always been an advocate for justice. They set up a meeting for the following evening. That night, Beatrice and John sat together, going over the documents and preparing for their meeting. As they worked, Beatrice felt a sense of camaraderie and purpose that she hadn't felt in a long time. Despite the danger, she was grateful to have John by her side. The next evening, they met with the journalist, a seasoned reporter named David Carter. David listened intently as they laid out their findings, his expression growing more serious with each revelation. "This is big," David said finally. "If we're going to do this, we need to make sure we have everything lined up perfectly. We'll need corroborating evidence, witness testimonies, and a plan to release the information in a way that ensures maximum impact." Beatrice and John nodded in agreement. They spent hours strategizing with David, mapping out their approach and identifying potential allies who could support their cause. The stakes were high, and they knew there was no room for error. In the days that followed, Beatrice and John worked tirelessly to gather additional evidence and secure the cooperation of key witnesses. They reached out to former employees of the Harrison family and other victims of Eleanor's schemes, slowly building a network of support. As they delved deeper, Beatrice began to see the extent of the damage Eleanor had caused. Families had been ruined, businesses destroyed, and lives shattered by her relentless pursuit of power. The more they uncovered, the more determined Beatrice became to see justice served. One evening, as they reviewed their progress, John looked at Beatrice with a mixture of admiration and concern. "Are you sure you're ready for this? Once we go public, there's no turning back." Beatrice met his gaze, her resolve unwavering. "I'm ready, John. We've come too far to back down now. This isn't just about my father anymore. It's about all the people who've suffered because of your mother's actions." John nodded, a fierce determination in his eyes. "Then let's do this." The day of the big reveal arrived, and the air was thick with anticipation. David had arranged for a press conference, ensuring that the story would reach a wide audience. Beatrice and John stood side by side, their hands clasped tightly together as they faced the gathered reporters. As David began to speak, outlining the evidence and the gravity of the situation, Beatrice felt a surge of emotion. This was the moment they had been working towards, the culmination of all their efforts. She glanced at John, and he gave her a reassuring smile. When it was their turn to speak, Beatrice stepped forward, her voice steady despite the whirlwind of emotions inside her. She recounted her father's story, the betrayal they had suffered, and the journey that had led them to this moment. John followed, exposing his mother's crimes and pledging to help right the wrongs that had been committed. The press conference ended with a flurry of questions and flashing cameras. As they left the venue, Beatrice felt a weight lift off her shoulders. The truth was out, and there was no turning back. The days following the press conference were a whirlwind of activity. The town of Riverstone was abuzz with the revelations, and the Harrison family's influence was rapidly crumbling. Eleanor, however, was not one to go down without a fight. She immediately began her counteroffensive, denying all allegations and trying to discredit Beatrice and John. Beatrice knew they needed to stay vigilant. She and John spent countless hours with David Carter, ensuring that every piece of evidence was verified and ready for the inevitable legal battles. The tension was palpable, but their resolve remained firm. One evening, as Beatrice was closing up the cafe, John rushed in, his face pale and anxious. "My mother knows we're behind this," he said, his voice urgent. "She's planning something, Beatrice. We need to be prepared." Beatrice felt a chill run down her spine. She had expected retaliation, but hearing it confirmed was unsettling. "What do you think she'll do?" John shook his head. "I'm not sure, but we can't take any chances. We need to gather all our allies and make sure everyone is protected." They quickly organized a meeting with their closest supporters, including Emily and other key witnesses. As they strategized, Beatrice couldn't shake the feeling of impending danger. Eleanor was a formidable opponent, and she wouldn't go down without a fight. The night of the confrontation arrived unexpectedly. Beatrice was at home, reviewing documents, when she heard a knock at her door. She opened it to find Eleanor standing there, her expression cold and calculating. "May I come in?" Eleanor asked, her voice deceptively polite. Beatrice hesitated but stepped aside. Eleanor entered, her eyes scanning the room with disdain. "You've caused quite a stir, Beatrice," she said, her tone icy. But you've made a grave mistake. Beatrice stood her ground, refusing to be intimidated. The only mistake was thinking you could get away with what you've done. Eleanor's eyes narrowed. You don't understand the lengths I'll go to protect my family's legacy. You're in over your head. Before Beatrice could respond, John appeared at the door, having followed his mother. It's over, Mother, he said firmly. You can't intimidate us anymore. The truth is out. Eleanor's gaze shifted to John, a mixture of anger and betrayal in her eyes. You think you're so righteous, don't you? Turning against your own family? I'm doing what's right, John replied, his voice steady. This has to end. Eleanor's composure cracked, and for a moment, Beatrice saw the desperation in her eyes. You'll regret this, she hissed. Both of you. With that, Eleanor stormed out, leaving a tense silence in her wake. Beatrice turned to John, her heart pounding. What do we do now? We stay vigilant, John said, taking her hand. She's dangerous, but we've come too far to back down. Over the next few days, the tension in Riverstone escalated. Eleanor's attempts to discredit Beatrice and John became more aggressive, but they held their ground. The evidence they had gathered was irrefutable, and public opinion was shifting against Eleanor. One evening, as Beatrice and John were reviewing their plans, they received a call from David. We've got a break, he said excitedly. A former associate of Eleanor's is willing to testify. This could be the final nail in the coffin. Beatrice felt a surge of hope. This testimony could seal Eleanor's fate. They arranged to meet the associate, ensuring that the information would be safely delivered to the authorities. As they prepared for the meeting, Beatrice couldn't help but feel a sense of impending closure. They were on the brink of achieving justice, but the final confrontation loomed ahead. She knew they had to be prepared for anything. The night of the meeting arrived, and Beatrice and John stood side by side, ready to face whatever came next. They had fought long and hard, and now they were closer than ever to seeing justice served. The tension was palpable as Beatrice and John made their way to the meeting with the former associate of Eleanor. The weight of their mission pressed heavily on their shoulders, but they knew this could be the turning point they had been working towards. They arrived at a small, dimly lit cafe on the outskirts of town, the perfect location for a clandestine meeting. Inside, they spotted David sitting at a corner table with a man who looked nervous and wary. David waved them over, and they quickly joined the group, exchanging brief introductions. This is Marcus, David said, gesturing to the man. He used to work closely with Eleanor and has agreed to share what he knows. Marcus nodded, his eyes darting around the room. I'm risking a lot by being here, he began, his voice shaky. But it's time the truth came out. Eleanor has been involved in illegal activities for years. She used her influence to manipulate deals, bribe officials, and ruin anyone who stood in her way. Beatrice leaned forward, her heart racing. Do you have evidence to back this up? Marcus nodded, pulling out a stack of papers from his bag. I kept records of everything. Emails, contracts, financial transactions. It's all here. John took the documents, his expression one of grim determination. This is what we need to bring her down. As they reviewed the evidence, Beatrice felt a mix of relief and anxiety. This was the final piece of the puzzle, but they needed to be cautious. Eleanor wouldn't go down without a fight, and they had to ensure their safety and that of their allies. They thanked Marcus for his courage and promised to protect his identity as much as possible. With the new evidence in hand, they headed straight to the authorities, presenting the full extent of Eleanor's crimes. The next few days were a whirlwind of legal proceedings and media coverage. The weight of the revelations shook Riverstone to its core, and the public outcry was immediate and intense. Eleanor was arrested, her empire crumbling around her as the truth came to light. But the victory was bittersweet. Beatrice and John had achieved what they set out to do, but the cost had been high. Their relationship had been tested to its limits, and the scars of their journey were still fresh. One evening, as they sat together in Beatrice's apartment, John turned to her with a look of deep contemplation. We did it, he said softly. But where do we go from here? Beatrice sighed, the weight of their ordeal heavy on her heart. I don't know, John. Everything feels so uncertain now. John took her hand, his touch reassuring. We'll figure it out. Together. We've come this far, and I don't want to lose what we've built. Beatrice nodded, feeling a glimmer of hope. I love you, John. Despite everything, I'm glad we found each other. I love you too, John replied, pulling her into an embrace. We'll get through this. One step at a time. As they held each other, Beatrice felt a sense of closure. The battle was over, but the journey ahead was just beginning. They had faced the darkness together, and now they could look forward to a future built on truth and love. The following week, the town of Riverstone began to heal. With Eleanor's influence gone, people started to rebuild and move forward. Beatrice and John continued their work, helping to restore the community and support those who had been affected by Eleanor's actions. Their love grew stronger with each passing day, fortified by the trials they had overcome. They knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy, but they were ready to face it together. And so, as the dust settled and a new dawn broke over Riverstone, Beatrice and John stood side by side, ready to embrace the future and the promise of a better tomorrow. The fallout from Eleanor's arrest sent shockwaves through Riverstone, but it also paved the way for healing and renewal. The town, once under the shadow of the Harrison family's corruption, began to breathe freely again. Beatrice and John played crucial roles in this transformation, working tirelessly to help the community rebuild and regain trust. Beatrice's father, now aware of the full extent of Eleanor's crimes and his own past mistakes, found a renewed sense of peace. His health slowly improved, and he was grateful for the justice his daughter had fought so hard to achieve. One afternoon, as Beatrice visited him in the hospital, they shared a quiet moment of reflection. You did an amazing job, my daughter, her father said, his voice filled with pride. You brought justice not just for me, but for everyone who suffered at the hands of the Harrisons. Beatrice smiled, feeling a sense of accomplishment. It was a hard fight, Dad, but it was worth it. And now, we can start over. As she left the hospital, Beatrice felt a renewed sense of purpose. The journey had been long and arduous, but it had brought her closer to the truth and to herself. She was ready to embrace the future and the new beginnings it promised. At the cafe, business was booming. The community had rallied around Beatrice, recognizing her courage and resilience. She had become a symbol of hope and determination, and the cafe had become a gathering place for those seeking solace and connection. One evening, as Beatrice was closing up, John walked in, carrying a bouquet of flowers. He handed them to her with a smile. For you, Beatrice. To celebrate everything we've accomplished. Beatrice took the flowers, feeling a rush of warmth. Thank you, John. For everything. They sat down together, the dim light of the cafe creating a cozy ambience. John took her hand, his expression serious. There's something I want to talk to you about. Beatrice looked at him, her heart skipping a beat. What is it? John took a deep breath. I've been thinking a lot about our future. We've been through so much together, and I can't imagine my life without you. I want us to build a life together, to continue this journey side by side. Tears filled Beatrice's eyes as she listened to his words. I want that too, John. More than anything. John smiled, pulling her into a tender embrace. Then let's do it. Let's create the future we've always dreamed of. The following weeks were filled with plans and preparations. Beatrice and John decided to stay in Riverstone, dedicating themselves to the town and its people. They worked together to expand the cafe, turning it into a community hub where people could gather, share stories, and support each other. Their love continued to grow, strengthened by the challenges they had faced and the victories they had achieved. They knew there would be more obstacles ahead, but they were ready to face them together, armed with the lessons they had learned and the bond they had forged. One evening, as they stood on the porch of the cafe, watching the sunset, Beatrice felt a deep sense of contentment. She turned to John, her eyes reflecting the golden light. "We did it, John. We made it through." John nodded, his arm around her shoulders. "Yes, we did. And I couldn't have done it without you." As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a warm glow over the town, Beatrice and John stood together, ready to embrace whatever the future held. They had faced the darkness and emerged stronger, their love a beacon of hope and resilience. And so, with hearts full of hope and hands intertwined, they stepped into their new life, knowing that together, they could overcome anything. The cafe buzzed with the lively chatter of Riverstone's residents, a testament to the renewed spirit of the town. Beatrice and John had worked tirelessly to transform the cafe into a welcoming community hub, and their efforts had paid off. It had become a place where people felt connected, supported, and hopeful. One sunny morning, Beatrice stood behind the counter, watching the familiar faces of her friends and neighbors. The transformation of the cafe mirrored the changes within herself. She had found peace and purpose, and it filled her with a deep sense of fulfillment. John walked in, carrying a box of fresh pastries. He placed them on the counter and kissed Beatrice on the cheek. "Morning, love. How's everything going?" Beatrice smiled, her heart swelling with affection. "Great. The place is busier than ever. It's wonderful to see everyone coming together." John nodded, looking around the bustling cafe. "We've built something special here. I'm proud of us." As they worked side by side, Beatrice reflected on their journey. They had faced so many challenges, but they had come out stronger on the other side. Their love had grown deeper, rooted in mutual respect and unwavering support. One afternoon, as Beatrice was taking a break on the porch, she saw Emily approaching with a bright smile. Emily had been an invaluable friend and ally throughout their ordeal, and Beatrice was grateful for her unwavering loyalty. "Hey, Beatrice," Emily greeted, sitting down beside her. "I just wanted to thank you for everything you've done for this town. You've brought so much hope and change." Beatrice smiled warmly. "Thank you, Emily. But I couldn't have done it without all the support from you and everyone else. We did this together." Emily nodded, her eyes shining with gratitude. "It feels like a new beginning for all of us. And I'm so happy to see you and John thriving." As they chatted, Beatrice felt a sense of camaraderie and unity that had been missing for so long. The community had rallied around her, and together, they had created something beautiful. That evening, Beatrice and John hosted a small gathering at the cafe to celebrate their success. Friends, neighbors, and supporters filled the space, sharing laughter and stories. Beatrice felt a profound sense of happiness as she looked around the room, knowing that they had built something lasting and meaningful. During the celebration, John raised a glass, drawing everyone's attention. "I just want to say a few words," he began, his voice filled with emotion. "This cafe, this community, is a testament to what we can achieve when we come together. Beatrice and I couldn't have done this without all of you. Thank you for your support and for believing in us." Beatrice's eyes welled with tears as she raised her glass. "To new beginnings and to a brighter future for Riverstone. Cheers!" The room erupted in cheers and applause, and Beatrice felt a warmth spread through her heart. This was what they had fought for, a community united, a future filled with hope and promise. As the night wore on and the celebration continued, Beatrice and John found a quiet moment together. They stepped outside, the cool night air a welcome contrast to the warmth inside the cafe. "I'm so proud of us, John," Beatrice said, leaning into his embrace. "We've come so far." John kissed her forehead, his eyes filled with love. "And we have so much more to look forward to. This is just the beginning." Beatrice smiled, feeling a deep sense of contentment. "I know. And I can't wait to see what the future holds." As they stood there, wrapped in each other's arms, Beatrice felt a sense of peace she had never known before. They had faced their demons, overcome their challenges, and emerged stronger. Together, they were ready to embrace whatever came next. And so, with hearts full of hope and a future bright with possibilities, Beatrice and John looked forward to the new beginnings that awaited them, knowing that together they could conquer anything. The next morning dawned bright and clear, a perfect reflection of the new beginnings that lay ahead for Beatrice and John. They had survived the storm, and now the calm brought with it a renewed sense of purpose and excitement for the future. Beatrice woke early, her mind already buzzing with ideas for the cafe. She wanted to expand their offerings, host more community events, and create even more opportunities for the people of Riverstone to come together. As she made breakfast, John joined her in the kitchen, his hair tousled from sleep but his eyes sparkling with enthusiasm. "Good morning," he said, wrapping his arms around her waist. "What's on the agenda for today?" Beatrice smiled, leaning into his embrace. "I was thinking about planning a community garden event. It would be a great way to get everyone involved and beautify the town." John nodded appreciatively. "I love that idea. And it fits perfectly with what we're trying to build here." After breakfast, they headed to the cafe to start their day. The regulars greeted them warmly, and the atmosphere was filled with a sense of optimism and collaboration. Beatrice spent the morning discussing the garden project with some of the patrons, and by lunchtime, she had a list of volunteers ready to help. That afternoon, as they were wrapping up, Beatrice received a phone call from David Carter. His voice was filled with excitement. "Beatrice, I have some great news. The story about Eleanor and the Harrisons has been picked up by several major news outlets. The investigation is gaining momentum, and more people are coming forward with information." Beatrice felt a surge of pride and relief. Their hard work was paying off, and justice was finally being served. "Thank you, David. This means so much to us." David chuckled. "You and John did the heavy lifting. I'm just glad to be a part of it. Keep me posted on how things are going there." As she hung up, Beatrice turned to John, her eyes shining. "The investigation is expanding. More people are coming forward." John smiled, a look of satisfaction on his face. "That's incredible news. We're making a real difference." As the weeks went by, Beatrice and John continued to pour their hearts into the cafe and the community. The garden project took off, bringing together people of all ages to plant flowers, vegetables, and trees. The cafe hosted poetry readings, art exhibitions, and music nights, becoming a cultural hub for Riverstone. One evening, as they were closing up after a particularly successful event, John took Beatrice's hand and led her to the porch. The stars were bright in the night sky, and a gentle breeze rustled the leaves. "I've been thinking," John said, his voice soft but serious. "We've done so much here, but I want to do more. I want to start a foundation to support local businesses, provide scholarships, and help those in need. What do you think?" Beatrice's heart swelled with love and admiration. "I think that's an amazing idea. And I want to be a part of it." John smiled, pulling her into his arms. "I knew I could count on you. Together, we can make a real impact." As they stood there, dreaming about the future, Beatrice felt a profound sense of gratitude. The journey had been long and difficult, but it had brought them to this moment. They had found each other, discovered their true strength, and built something beautiful. The path ahead was still uncertain, filled with challenges and opportunities. But Beatrice knew that with John by her side, they could face anything. Their love had been tested and had emerged stronger, a beacon of hope and resilience. And so, as they looked out over the town they had come to love, Beatrice and John embraced the future with open hearts. They had turned their pain into purpose, their struggles into strength, and their dreams into reality. Together, they were ready to walk the path ahead, hand in hand, and make the world a better place, one step at a time.